types based on their structure. And also remember we have 3 types based on their function. So what are the 3 types based on their function? Motor, sensory, and interneurons, right, very good. Motor, sensory, and interneurons. And the 3 types based on their structure? Right, so unipolar, bipolar, and multipolar, right? Okay, so you want to know what their functions are, like which one of these would be our motor neurons. Motor neurons are motor neurons are multipolar. Same thing with interneurons, right? So multipolar neurons would be motor neurons, interneurons. Bipolar would be special senses, okay, etc. Also, we took a look at a neuron kind of in a more detailed way, so you should know things like, the Nissl bodies, right? Also called chromatophilic substance, okay, neurofibrils, axon hillock, dendrites, etc. Okay. And we talked about different types of synapses. Okay, so based on where the synapse is located, like we talked about axodendritic. What if the axon is synapsing on the cell body? Axosomatic. Right. And the axonic. Okay, so again, just based on the location, we have these different types of synapses. Okay, and then we moved on to neuroglia. So for the different neuroglial cells, you want to be able to identify these. Also, you guys, let me backtrack just for a second. I will ask you to identify the different types of neurons based on their structure. Remember, you have a picture of each of those in chapter 14, so you should know what they look like and be able to identify their processes, the axon and the dendrite or dendrites. Okay, same thing with the neuroglial cells. Be able to identify these in the diagrams that show them in chapter 14. Okay, and you should know what their functions are for the written exam. And also if they're in the CNS or PNS. Okay, and then we talked a little bit about the myelin sheath. We talked about the 2 types of conduction. What do we call that type of conduction we see in a myelinated axon?
Saltatory.
Saltatory, right. So saltatory versus continuous conduction. Which one of these is faster?
Saltatory.
Saltatory, right. Okay, and then also in chapter 14, it talks about the structure of a nerve. So just as far as the different layers of connective tissue, right? Like endoneurium, perineurium, epineurium, you should know where those are located. I will have you identify those in a diagram. The diagram of the nerve will be on the practical exam. Okay, just shows the layers of connective tissue. Okay, so the brain. It's a bunch of stuff. Okay, so you want to know the parts of the ventricles. Also, remember that each ventricle has a structure called the choroid plexus, right? What does the choroid plexus produce? Cerebrospinal fluid, very good. And what is this composed of? Ependymal cells and the underlying capillaries, very good. So we know that this is where cerebrospinal fluid comes from. And we know it circulates through the ventricles and then it leaves the ventricles and goes into what space? What space contains cerebrospinal fluid? The subarachnoid, right? Okay, so you need to know the layers of the meninges and the spaces. Okay, layers of meninges and these spaces between them. So you should know if those spaces are potential spaces or actual spaces, right? And for those actual spaces, what do they contain? Like, for instance, a subarachnoid contains cerebrospinal fluid. So we know that cerebrospinal fluid comes from the ventricles, circulates through the ventricles, goes out into the subarachnoid space, circulates around the brain and the spinal cord, and it's eventually reabsorbed where? Into the blood? What location would that be?
Superior sagittal sinus.
The superior sagittal sinus, yes. So you should know the pathway of flow of CSF. Okay, be able to trace that all the way to the superior sagittal sinus. Okay, and then we started going through different regions or different parts of the brain. We talked about a bunch of different nuclei and tracts and things like that. So when you review those, you want to remember two things. Okay, so for the different parts of the brain, like for instance, just use for instance, the red nucleus. You want to ask yourself, what is its function? And what region of the brain is it located in? Okay, so function and brain region. Now, we know that the function of the red nucleus is motor coordination. So for those parts of the brain, as we went through them, I tried to kind of just tell you in a kind of a, just basically what the function is. That's all you need to know. You do not need any more detail. If the book goes into more detail, you do not need to know any more detail about them. Just what I told you is fine. Okay, and you guys should find all of this in the PowerPoint. So for this unit, I made the PowerPoints more complete, so you should be able to study really just from the PowerPoints. Okay, don't have to worry about the study guide, you don't have to worry about the book. You really can get everything from the PowerPoints. Okay. Now as far as the brain region, what that means is we have these major parts of the brain like the cerebrum, the diencephalon, right? The brain regions would be the cerebrum, okay, the diencephalon, the midbrain, pons, medulla, and cerebellum. Okay, these are the regions. So I may ask you, like for instance, what region of the brain is the red nucleus located in? Okay, so you should know that for all those different parts of the brain that we talked about. So as you're going through them, just keep reminding yourself, right? The thalamus, the sensory relay station, it's in the diencephalon. The hypothalamus, autonomic functions, diencephalon. Just keep reminding yourself where they're located. Now during the practical exam, you guys know you always want to be as specific as you can, so name exactly what I'm pointing to. But if you can't remember the name of the structure, if you want to name the region, I will give you a half point. Okay, just so you know, you will have a half point if you want to name that larger region. Okay, any questions on any parts of the brain that you can think of? Okay, and then we talked about the cranial nerves, or I wrote all that stuff down on the board. So for cranial nerves, you need to know the name and the number. On the practical exam, I will have you identify some of them on that figure 1524, okay? That shows them all coming out of the brain. You can use the name or the number, I don't care, okay? You have to know both of these though for the written exam. But for the practical exam, you can use either one. If you use the number, make sure you use the Roman numerals, okay? Otherwise, I'll only give you a half point. Okay, so for the written exam, you want to know the name and the number and the information that they carry. Okay. I know that's a lot of stuff. some of those are actually very simple, so I'm sure that, some of them you can learn pretty quickly. If you just go through them a few times, you'll pick a lot of it up very fast. Okay, so when we talked about the spinal cord, you should know the different parts of the spinal cord, okay, the different parts of the gray matter, the white matter. Spinal nerves. This is something I think is actually really helpful. I may have said this before, but if you draw your own cross-section through the spinal cord and put in a spinal nerve with the motor and the sensory neuron, and you can even draw, like the rami of the spinal nerve, you can include those, because it's not that complicated, but it's easy to get mixed up, okay? So I think it's helpful to draw it and label it yourself. So you want to know the roots of the spinal nerve and what neurons travel in those, the rami, okay. Any questions on any of that? Okay, and then we talked about the plexuses. For each plexus, you want to know the spinal nerves that form the plexus. Okay, like for instance, a cervical is C1 through C4. Okay, and you want to know the nerves that we talked about. Okay, so let's just say nerves discussed in class. And just the general area that they supply. So this is exactly what we talked about. It's exactly what's in the PowerPoint. Remember, you do not need any more detail. You don't need to know all the muscles supplied and all that. Okay, and then the autonomic nervous system. So for the autonomic nervous system, these are the 4 things you need to know. Okay? And this is mostly just written exam material. Remember, for the autonomic nervous system, autonomic, for the practical, there's only the one diagram that shows the sympathetic trunk and the 2 rami, right? The white and gray ramus. And the sympathetic trunk you can see on this model, right? The pink thingies here. And you can see the sympathetic trunk on this model. Okay, other than that, this is all written exam. Okay, so you should know the effects of the 2 divisions if you just memorize this right here, right? You can figure out all the effects. Location of the preganglionic neurons. Again, if you just memorize parasympathetic is craniosacral, that will tell you a lot, okay? You should know the parasympathetic neurons that travel with these 4 cranial nerves. I will ask you about those, or some of them. Okay, for sympathetic, again, just memorize thoracolumbar, and that will at least help you to remember that the preganglionic neurons are from T1 through L2 for sympathetic. Okay, and then know the ganglia and the neurotransmitters. Okay, and that is it. So if you guys want me to go over anything with you, just yell. If you have questions, you can email me. At least the World Series will be over after this evening, so that will make it easier. Uh-huh. The pathway of flow of CSF? Okay. So the question is about the pathway of flow of cerebrospinal fluid. So let's start this in the lateral ventricles. What are those little connections between the lateral ventricles and the third? Interventricular foramina. this. Okay, so from here, CSF enters the third ventricle. What's next?
Cerebral aqueduct.
Exactly, cerebral aqueduct. And then what's after that?
Fourth ventricle.
Fourth ventricle. Okay, so you guys know that the fourth ventricle has those openings that are called apertures. Right. So it has the two lateral apertures and one median aperture, and this will allow CSF to go from the fourth ventricle. It actually can now go into two places. It can go directly into the central canal of the spinal cord, and it can also go into the subarachnoid space, right? So when it goes into the subarachnoid space, it can circulate around the brain and around the cord. And eventually it will travel through the little arachnoid villi. And these project into what space? The superior sagittal sinus. Yeah, and I call it a space because it is a space between the layers of the dura mater. You guys know it contains blood, but the little arachnoid villi extend up into that sinus. And so this is where now cerebrospinal fluid just mixes with the blood in this sinus. And so it just becomes part of the blood plasma again. And remember that each of the ventricles has its own choroid plexus. So they all contribute cerebrospinal fluid to the total volume.